The Vengeful Spirit That Changed a Village. Summary. In a remote village ruled by the cruel Mr. Kean, fear dominates the lives of its people. His son Victor, arrogant and entitled, mirrors his father's tyranny. One day, Victor becomes obsessed with a mysterious girl whose beauty is as haunting as it is enchanting. Despite his efforts to find her, she vanishes under eerie circumstances, sparking whispers of ghosts and vengeance among the villagers. Supernatural events soon plague the Kean mansion. Victor and his father experience chilling hauntings, from ghostly whispers to terrifying apparitions. The girl's spirit, relentless and vengeful, reveals herself as a force seeking justice for the family's atrocities. Desperate, Mr. Kean attempts a ritual to banish the spirits, but the ceremony fails catastrophically. The ground beneath the mansion collapses, swallowing both father and son, ending their reign of terror. The villagers, freed from their oppressors, rebuild their lives, though they leave the cursed mansion untouched. Its ruins stand as a warning of the consequences of unchecked cruelty and greed, a place haunted by the echoes of vengeance and justice. Part 1. Tyranny and Fear. The village nestled deep in the valley had long been a picture of quiet desperation. Under the oppressive rule of Mr. Kean, its people lived in perpetual fear. The mere mention of his name sent shivers down spines, his presence looming over them like an unrelenting storm. Mr. Kean, a landowner of immense wealth, wielded his power with cruelty that knew no bounds. His word was law, and his punishments were as swift as they were brutal. Victor, his only son, was a mirror image of his father in both appearance and demeanor. With an entitled swagger, Victor roamed the village streets accompanied by his loyal servants, who carried parasols and trays of fruit for his every whim. He delighted in the villagers' suffering, exploiting their poverty for his own amusement. Children cried silently when they saw him approach. Their parents bowed their heads, praying he would pass without incident. One day, Victor found a young farmer struggling to pull his ox cart out of the mud. Instead of helping, Victor ordered his men to trample the farmer's only means of livelihood. The farmer knelt in the dirt, tears mingling with the sweat on his face, begging for mercy. Victor merely laughed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Perhaps you should try harder to please us next time," he sneered, walking away. Despite their fear, the villagers whispered amongst themselves. They spoke of Mr. Kean's ruthless eviction of families, his confiscation of lands, and his treatment of those who dared to stand against him. Some elders recalled a time before the Kean family's rise to power, a time of fairness and community. But those days were now distant memories. The Kean mansion itself was a reflection of its master, grand yet foreboding. Its tall, blackened walls cast shadows over the fields, and its spiked iron gates seemed to mock the struggling lives outside. Within, the halls echoed with the sound of Victor's laughter and Mr. Kean's barked commands. Servants scurried about, too afraid to meet their master's eyes, their lives a testament to servitude and despair. Even within the mansion, there was no reprieve for the servants. Their quarters were cramped and damp, hidden away in the dark corners of the sprawling estate. They were forbidden from speaking unless spoken to, and lived in constant fear of punishment. At night they would huddle together, whispering their fears and sharing fleeting dreams of escape. The sound of Mr. Kean's heavy footsteps or Victor's chilling laughter was enough to send them into silence. But there was something more than fear brewing in the hearts of the villagers. It was a quiet, festering hatred, a wish for retribution, whispered in the safety of darkness. They dared not voice their thoughts aloud, but their eyes betrayed a glimmer of hope that one day, justice might find the Kean family. Victor, oblivious to the mounting resentment, continued his reign of terror. He delighted in visiting the market, where he forced vendors to sell him their finest goods for a pittance or risk losing everything. One morning, a young girl's doll slipped from her grasp and rolled to Victor's feet. He picked it up, studying the hand-sewn toy with mock curiosity. When the girl's mother rushed forward to retrieve it, Victor crushed it under his boot and smirked. "Teach your child not to bother me again," he said coldly, before turning away. These acts of cruelty only deepened the villagers' hatred. They began to share stories in hushed voices, tales of spirits and curses that could bring an end to the Kean dynasty. Elders spoke of the old forest that bordered the village, a place they claimed held ancient powers. The forest, they said, had seen the suffering of the people and might yet rise to protect them. As the days turned into months, the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavier on the village. The people carried on, bound by survival, but their spirits were fragile. Yet, deep in the forest that bordered the village, something stirred. A whisper among the trees, a presence unseen yet keenly felt. Those who wandered too far claimed to hear voices, faint and sorrowful, calling out for justice. Victor remained oblivious, dismissing the murmurs of curses as nothing more than the superstitions of peasants. Mr. Kean, however, grew uneasy. He had always believed in power and control, but the growing unease among the villagers was a reminder that fear could be unpredictable. He increased his guards and ordered harsher punishments for any perceived disobedience, but the whispers persisted. Unrest in the shadows. Though the villagers feared speaking out, their emotions bubbled under the surface. Late at night, huddled around fires, they began recounting tales of spectral figures seen in the woods and whispers of a greater force waiting to strike back at the Kean family. These tales were once mere folklore, but now they carried a weight of eerie possibility. The old forest, dense with ancient trees and suffused with an air of mystery, began to feel alive. Birds and animals that once thrived on its edges were silent, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. A woodcutter claimed he had seen a figure in white wandering the forest, a woman with flowing hair, who vanished when he called out. Another villager spoke of hearing cries carried on the wind, too human to be a trick of the mind. It is the spirits, an elder whispered to his grandchildren. They are stirring because they feel our pain. Within the Kean mansion, Victor grew restless. Though he laughed off the villagers' stories, a shadow of doubt lingered in his mind. The hallways of the grand estate began to feel less inviting, their dark corners stretching unnaturally at night. Servants whispered of doors opening on their own and shadows darting past their vision. Mr. Kean dismissed their fears, attributing the disturbances to the servants' incompetence. Yet even he felt the air grow heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching. Victor decided to prove his fearlessness. One evening, he ventured into the marketplace, calling out to the villagers gathered there. If there are ghosts or spirits here, let them come to me. I will show you all that your superstitions are nothing. His voice echoed, but the crowd remained silent. His words meant to mock, only deepen the unease, for they felt like an invitation to forces beyond comprehension. The days that followed brought strange occurrences. Livestock vanished, their pens left open. Crops wilted overnight under a moonless sky. A chilling wind swept through the village, carrying with it whispers that no one could understand but everyone feared. The villagers looked to the mansion, their hope and terror intertwined. And then, on one fateful night, the haunting began in earnest. Part 2. An enchanting encounter. It was a day like any other in the bustling marketplace, where villagers bartered goods under the oppressive gaze of the Kean family's mansion looming in the distance. Victor strolled through the narrow pathways, his servants trailing behind with parasols and baskets. His presence cast a shadow of unease, forcing vendors to hurriedly pack their wares and mothers to pull their children close. The stifling air of fear followed Victor wherever he went, feeding his insatiable ego. As he turned a corner, something caught his attention. A flash of movement, a girl, unlike any he had ever seen. She stood among the crowd, her long, flowing hair shimmering in the sunlight, her delicate features a stark contrast to the bleak faces around her. She wore a simple white dress that swayed gently with the breeze, yet it seemed to radiate an ethereal glow. Her eyes, deep and mesmerizing, locked briefly with his, and in that moment, the world seemed to fade away. Victor's heart skipped a beat, an unfamiliar sensation of intrigue stirring within him. Before he could gather his composure, the girl turned and disappeared into the throng. Startled, Victor shoved aside a fruit vendor's cart, spilling oranges onto the dirt road. "Find her," he barked at his servants, his voice tinged with desperation. The men scattered, their eyes darting frantically through the marketplace, but the girl was nowhere to be seen. Victor's mind raced as he stormed back to the mansion, his usual arrogance overshadowed by an uncharacteristic frustration. Who was she? How could someone so captivating vanish so easily? That night, as he reclined in his opulent chamber, her image lingered in his mind. Her eyes seemed to follow him, haunting and beckoning. Sleep eluded him as his thoughts spiraled into obsession. The following day, Victor returned to the market, scanning every face with an intensity that unnerved even his servants. He questioned vendors and passers-by, but no one claimed to have seen the girl. Whispers spread among the villagers, their fear of Victor mingling with curiosity. Perhaps she was a spirit, an old woman muttered to her neighbor. The suggestion, though whispered, reached Victor's ears. He dismissed it with a sneer, but deep down, the possibility unsettled him. Days turned into weeks, and Victor's obsession only grew. He instructed his men to scour the village and surrounding areas, offering rewards for any information about the mysterious girl. Rumors began to swirl. Some said she was a traveler passing through. Others claimed she was a ghost tied to the old forest. Victor's frustration mounted with each dead end. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the mansion, Victor stood on the balcony overlooking the village. The oppressive silence of the evening was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. As he stared into the distance, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. His breath caught in his throat. It was her. Without a second thought, Victor grabbed a lantern and descended the mansion's grand staircase. Ignoring the startled cries of his servants, he made his way toward the forest, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. The figure remained motionless, her outline barely visible against the darkening sky. As Victor approached, she turned and slipped into the woods. The forest was dense, its towering trees blocking out the last remnants of daylight. Victor's lantern cast flickering shadows that danced menacingly on the gnarled trunks. The air grew colder, and an eerie stillness enveloped him. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice echoing through the silence. There was no reply, only the faint rustling of leaves. Suddenly a soft, melodic voice drifted through the trees. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakably hers. "Why do you follow me, Victor?" His name on her lips sent a shiver down his spine. He turned in circles, the lantern's light revealing nothing but darkness. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The laughter that followed was gentle yet haunting, as though it echoed from another world. "You will see me again, but only when you are ready." The voice faded, leaving Victor standing alone in the suffocating silence of the forest. When he finally emerged from the woods, his servants found him pale and trembling, his once unshakable arrogance replaced by confusion and fear. He dismissed their questions with a curt wave and retreated to his chambers. That night, as he lay in bed, the girl's voice echoed in his mind, her words a cryptic riddle he could not solve. Victor's nights became a blur of sleepless hours and feverish dreams. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing at the edge of a misty river, her white dress billowing as though caught in an unseen current. Her gaze was piercing, a mixture of sorrow and defiance that left him restless. He awoke drenched in sweat, his heart racing, her voice still whispering in his ears. The mansion, once filled with Victor's domineering presence, became eerily quiet. Servants tiptoed through the halls, their movements careful, their voices hushed. They whispered of their master's strange behavior, of how he no longer commanded with his usual bravado. Even Mr. Kean grew concerned, though his stern inquiries were met with dismissive shrugs. Victor kept his torment hidden, unable to confide in anyone about the ghostly girl who consumed his every thought. Desperate for answers, Victor began frequenting the forest, drawn by an invisible thread that he couldn't sever. Each night he carried his lantern into the shadowy depths, calling out for her. And each night, the forest answered with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Yet he felt her presence, a tangible weight in the air, a faint warmth that sent chills down his spine. One fateful night, the forest came alive. As Victor ventured deeper, the lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural stillness. Then from the darkness she emerged. Her figure was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably hers. Her hair floated around her like a halo, and her eyes, those haunting eyes, fixed on Victor with an intensity that rooted him in place. "Why do you chase what you cannot hold?" she asked, her voice a melody of sorrow and accusation. Victor's breath hitched, his words caught in his throat. I need to know who you are," he stammered. Her expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "You are not ready to understand, but you will be." She began to fade, her outline dissolving into the shadows. "When the truth comes, will you face it, or will you face it, or will you run?" Victor lunged forward, his hand outstretched, but she was gone. The forest returned to its oppressive silence, leaving him alone with the echo of her words. Trembling, he stumbled back to the mansion, her cryptic message seared into his mind. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy tension. Victor's obsession with the girl deepened, his need to unravel the mystery consuming him. Yet with every step closer to the truth, he felt the weight of something far greater looming, a force that promised both revelation and ruin. And as the whispers of the forest grew louder, Victor realized he was not just chasing a girl, he was chasing a destiny he could neither escape nor control. Part 3. Whispers of the Supernatural. Victor's frantic search for the enigmatic girl stretched on for weeks, but his efforts bore no fruit. The mysterious figure seemed to vanish as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a growing restlessness within him. The villagers, ever watchful, whispered among themselves about his strange behavior. They knew of his obsessive inquiries, his sleepless nights, and his frequent solitary visits to the edge of the forest. Rumors began to take root in the fertile soil of their collective imagination. "She was not human," one elderly woman muttered to a group of neighbors gathered around a flickering oil lamp. "I've heard the spirits of the forest take human form to lure the unworthy." "Or perhaps she was a ghost," another chimed in, her voice trembling. "One of the many who've suffered under the Kean family. Maybe she's here for revenge." The whispers spread like wildfire, fueled by the villagers' simmering resentment toward the Kean family and their own deep-seated fears of the supernatural. By day they continued their toil, casting wary glances toward the mansion and the forest beyond. By night, their stories grew darker and more vivid, weaving a tapestry of spectral vengeance that began to take on a life of its own. Victor, though outwardly indifferent to the murmurs of the villagers, could not shake the unsettling feeling that their tales held a kernel of truth. The girl's image haunted his dreams, her voice echoing in his mind. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing in the forest, her pale figure glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her eyes, filled with an unknowable sadness, seemed to plead with him, though he could not understand her silent message. One night, Victor awoke with a start. His room was shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the heavy curtains. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then he heard a faint, sorrowful melody, drifting through the stillness like a ghostly lullaby. He sat up, his heart pounding, straining to catch the sound. It was coming from outside. Throwing on his cloak, Victor grabbed a lantern and crept out of the mansion. The servants, accustomed to his nocturnal wanderings, dared not question him. The melody grew louder as he approached the forest, its haunting beauty pulling him forward like an invisible tether. He stumbled over roots and through dense undergrowth, the lantern's light flickering as the shadows around him seemed to shift and writhe. Finally, he reached a small clearing. The melody ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Victor stood frozen, his breath visible in the cold night air. He felt a presence, unseen but undeniable. "Show yourself," he called, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and defiance. The air grew colder still, and a soft mist began to swirl around him. From the fog emerged a figure tall, ethereal, and unmistakably familiar. It was the girl. She looked at him with the same haunting gaze that had tormented his dreams. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Victor felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to her, but his limbs felt rooted to the ground. "Why do you haunt me?" he finally managed to whisper. Her expression softened, a flicker of sorrow crossing her face. She raised a hand, pointing toward the heart of the forest, before dissolving into the mist. The clearing was empty once more. Victor stumbled back to the mansion, his mind racing. He could no longer deny it, the girl was not of this world. But what did she want from him? Why had she chosen him? And what lay hidden in the depths of the forest? As the days turned into weeks, the villagers' whispers grew louder. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the woods, of shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of their vision. Livestock began to disappear, and crops withered inexplicably. The village, already burdened by fear of the Kian family, now found itself suffocated by a growing dread of the supernatural. "It's the spirits," an old man declared, his voice trembling. "They're angry. They've come to punish us for standing by while the Kian family brought ruin to this land." The villagers began to avoid the forest entirely, even during the day. Children were forbidden from playing near its edges, and travelers hurried past it without so much as a glance. The once vibrant marketplace grew quieter, the air heavy with unspoken fears. Within the mansion, Victor's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent hours locked in his study, poring over ancient texts and maps in a desperate attempt to find answers. Servants reported hearing him muttering to himself, his voice tinged with both frustration and desperation. Even Mr. Kian began to notice his son's decline, though his stern inquiries were met with silence. One evening, as Victor sat alone in the library, he came across an old journal belonging to one of his ancestors. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but he could just make out the words. The journal spoke of a time long past when the forest was said to be sacred ground, protected by spirits who watched over the land and its people. But the arrival of the Kian family had disrupted the balance, their greed and cruelty angering the guardians of the forest. Victor read late into the night, the words filling him with a growing sense of unease. If the girl was one of these spirits, what did that mean for him and his family? And what price would they have to pay to appease her? The following night, Victor found himself standing once more at the edge of the forest. The villagers watched from their homes, peering cautiously through cracks in their shutters. They whispered prayers for protection, their fear for themselves outweighing any pity they might have felt for the troubled heir of the Kian family. Victor took a deep breath and stepped into the woods, the lantern in his hand casting long, flickering shadows. The forest seemed alive, its trees swaying in a wind he could not feel. He pushed forward, driven by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and an inexplicable pull he could not resist. Somewhere in the darkness he knew she was waiting. The air inside the forest felt thick, as though charged with energy. Every step Victor took seemed to echo, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence around him. His lantern flickered, its dim light casting twisted shadows on the surrounding trees. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to close in, the towering trunks creating a labyrinth that disoriented him. And then, just as he felt the weight of despair settling on him, he saw her. She stood ahead, partially obscured by mist, her pale figure glowing faintly in the darkness. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Victor stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who are you?" he whispered. The girl tilted her head, her expression inscrutable. Then, without a word, she turned and began to walk deeper into the forest. "Wait," Victor called, hurrying after her. The mist thickened around him, and the path grew treacherous. Roots seemed to reach out to trip him, branches clawing at his clothes. Still he pressed on, driven by an inexplicable need to uncover the truth. The girl remained just out of reach, her figure slipping in and out of sight like a phantom. Suddenly she stopped. Victor stumbled to a halt, his breathing ragged. They were in another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, ancient tree. Its gnarled roots twisted across the ground, and its branches stretched high into the sky, disappearing into the darkness. The girl turned to face him, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "Why have you come?" she asked, her voice soft but commanding. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. She stepped closer, and the air grew colder. "You do not belong here," she continued, her tone tinged with both warning and pity. Turn back. Before it is too late, Victor shook his head. I can't, he said, his voice trembling. I need to understand. The girl's gaze hardened. Understanding comes at a price, she said. Are you willing to pay it? Before Victor could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, and the shadows around the clearing began to writhe. The forest seemed to come alive, its trees groaning as though in pain. The girl stepped back, her form beginning to fade. Find the truth, she said, her voice echoing as her figure dissolved into the mist. But beware, some truths cannot be undone. Victor was left alone in the clearing, the weight of her words heavy on his mind. As the forest began to close in around him, he realized that he had only just begun to unravel the mystery and the dangers that surrounded the girl and the haunted land he called home. Part 4. First signs of haunting. The Kian mansion, vast and oppressive, had always been a symbol of wealth and dominance in the village. Yet, as Victor retired to his quarters one fateful evening, the once pristine walls seemed to close in, shadows stretching unnaturally long under the dim light of flickering candles. The air was heavy, laced with an unplaceable tension, as if the mansion itself had begun to breathe with an unseen force. Victor reclined in his grand four-poster bed, the drapes pulled tightly around him. Despite the luxurious silks and plush bedding, sleep evaded him. His mind, restless and consumed by thoughts of the girl, churned endlessly. Her face, pale and ethereal, lingered behind his eyelids whenever he closed them. Her haunting gaze seemed to pierce into his very soul. Somewhere in the silence of the night, a sound cut through, soft, deliberate, like footsteps on polished wood. Victor's eyes snapped open. He sat up, straining to hear, the faint rustling of the curtains blending with the rhythmic creaks. He shook his head, attributing the noise to the old mansion settling in the cold night air. And then it came again. A low melodic hum drifted through the air, faint but unmistakable. It was the same melody he had heard in the forest, the same sorrowful tune that had lured him to the girl before. His heart raced, a bead of sweat tracing a cold path down his temple. Throwing back the covers, he stood, the marble floor icy against his bare feet. Who's there? He called, his voice wavering. Silence answered him. He moved toward the door, his hand trembling as it grasped the brass handle. The hallway beyond was empty, bathed in the dim glow of a single lantern. Yet, the melody persisted, growing louder, pulling him further. He stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, the echoes of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive quiet. As he rounded the corner, the lanterns flickered violently, their light dimming and flaring as if caught in an unseen wind. The melody stopped abruptly. Victor froze, his breath caught in his throat. The temperature plummeted, his breath now visible in the chill, and then she appeared. The girl stood at the end of the corridor, her figure bathed in a pale, otherworldly glow. Her white dress seemed to float, untouched by gravity, and her hair flowed as though stirred by an invisible breeze. Her eyes met his, deep pools of sorrow and accusation. Why do you follow me? She whispered, her voice both soft and commanding, carrying an echo that reverberated through the empty hall. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was rooted in place, his limbs heavy, his mind swirling with fear and fascination. The girl raised a hand, her slender fingers pointing directly at him. The air around Victor grew dense, suffocating. He felt an invisible force pressing against his chest, forcing him to his knees. Her lips moved, but her words were inaudible, drowned by a sudden rush of wind that roared through the corridor. The lanterns extinguished, plunging the hall into darkness. When the light returned, she was gone. Victor stumbled back to his room, his mind reeling. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears. He locked the door behind him and slumped against it, his body trembling uncontrollably. The girl's presence lingered in the air. Her haunting image burned into his mind. The following days brought no reprieve. The mansion seemed to change, its once grand halls now cloaked in an unshakable gloom. Servants whispered of cold spots and strange sounds, their fearful murmurs growing louder with each passing hour. Victor dismissed their concerns outwardly, but inside he knew the truth. The girl, or whatever she was, had followed him back from the forest. One evening, as Victor sat in his study, poring over the old journal he had discovered, the room grew unnaturally quiet. The crackling of the fire ceased, and the shadows on the wall seemed to ripple. He looked up, his breath hitching as he saw her reflection in the glass of the window. She stood behind him, her face pale and expressionless. Victor spun around, but the room was empty. His chest tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he struggled to steady himself. The journal fell open to a page bearing a single line that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The past cannot be buried forever. That night, Victor dreamed of the girl. She stood in the forest once more, her figure obscured by mist. Her lips moved, but the words were lost to the howling wind. Around her, shadows twisted and writhed, taking on monstrous shapes that lunged toward Victor. He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, the echo of her voice lingering in his mind. You cannot escape. The haunting escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, whispers filled the air, and objects moved as though guided by invisible hands. Servants began to leave the mansion, their fear outweighing their loyalty. Even Mr. Kean, ever the skeptic, could not ignore the strange occurrences. Victor's torment deepened as the mansion took on a life of its own. The once familiar halls twisted in the darkness, their shadows seeming to reach for him like living entities. At night, he heard faint laughter, soft and childlike, but tinged with an unsettling edge. Mirrors cracked without cause, reflecting fleeting glimpses of the girl's sorrowful face before shattering entirely. In the kitchen, pots clattered to the floor, and the cook fled screaming, claiming to have seen blood dripping from the ceiling. Victor dismissed her as hysterical, but he could not ignore the sensation that the mansion itself was becoming an extension of her will. One stormy night, Victor stood at the top of the grand staircase, staring into the darkness below. Thunder rolled outside, illuminating the hall in sharp flashes of light. He gripped the banister tightly, his knuckles white. A sudden gust of wind tore through the mansion, extinguishing the candles and plunging everything into pitch blackness. Victor, the voice was unmistakable, soft yet commanding. He turned sharply, searching the darkness. The lightning illuminated her form for a brief moment, standing halfway down the staircase, her dress billowing as if caught in a gale. Her expression was no longer sorrowful but stern, her eyes filled with something between warning and accusation. "Why are you here?" Victor demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" Her reply came as a whisper, carried by the wind. "The truth. It waits for you." Victor felt the stairs shift beneath him, the wood creaking ominously. He stumbled backward, his hand grasping for support. When the light returned, she was gone once more, leaving only the faint sound of her melody hanging in the air. By morning, Victor's resolve was crumbling. The weight of her presence, the unrelenting signs of her haunting, and the cryptic messages she left in her wake consumed his every thought. He turned to the journal again, tracing the passages that spoke of his family's past, of land stolen, of promises broken, of lives taken in greed. The words blurred together as a chilling realization dawned: the girl's haunting was not random. It was a reckoning. The mansion grew quieter as more servants fled, leaving Victor alone with his father and a handful of loyal staff. Even Mr. Kean could no longer dismiss the strange occurrences, though he refused to speak of them aloud. The once mighty patriarch now spent his days locked in his study, emerging only to glare at his son with suspicion and unease. Victor's nights were sleepless, plagued by dreams that felt more like memories, visions of a time long past, of faces he did not recognize but whose pain he felt deeply. The girl's voice echoed in every corner of his mind, urging him toward a truth he was not sure he could face. Finally, on the darkest night yet, Victor awoke to find the girl standing at the foot of his bed. Her expression was soft once more, tinged with sadness. She reached out a hand, her fingers inches from his. "It's time," she whispered. Victor's heart raced, but he did not pull away. He felt the weight of her words settle over him, the inevitability of what was to come. The room seemed to dissolve around them, the walls fading into a swirling mist. The truth was near, and Victor could no longer run from it. But deep in his heart, he wondered, would it destroy him? Part 5. Terror grips the mansion. The days following Victor's chilling encounters brought a darkness to the Kean mansion that even its most seasoned servants could not ignore. What once stood as a symbol of dominance over the village was now a place of dread, its grand halls transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Servants moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions etched with fear. Some packed their belongings and left quietly in the dead of night, unwilling to endure the growing unease. The first signs of true terror came subtly. Phantom footsteps echoed through the corridors, their rhythm inconsistent, as if whoever or whatever walked the halls did so with deliberate malice. Lights flickered and extinguished without warning, leaving vast portions of the mansion in unsettling darkness. At times, Victor would find doors open that he distinctly remembered closing, and objects would vanish, only to reappear in odd places days later. Victor's father, Mr. Kian, dismissed the early incidents as figments of imagination, born from idle minds. He scoffed at the servants' fears, calling them superstitious fools. But even he could not explain the icy drafts that swept through the mansion on windless nights, nor the faint, sorrowful whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. One evening, as Victor wandered the dim corridors, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The shadows along the walls seemed to ripple unnaturally, stretching and bending as though alive. A sudden creak behind him made him spin around, his heart pounding. The corridor was empty, yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no response, only the oppressive silence that had become all too familiar. The next day, Victor's father experienced his first undeniable encounter. While reviewing estate ledgers in his study, Mr. Kian heard the faint sound of a woman humming. He paused, his pen hovering above the paper. The tune was melancholic, haunting, and it seemed to grow louder. Looking up, he saw the faint outline of a figure in the reflection of the study's large window. Whipping around, he found the room empty. His hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, but he said nothing of the incident to Victor. The mansion's torment escalated that night. Victor awoke to the sound of his wardrobe doors creaking open. Groggily, he sat up, peering through the darkness. His lantern flickered weakly on the bedside table. The wardrobe was ajar, its shadows yawning wide. Then, with an ear-piercing screech, the doors slammed shut on their own. Victor's breath caught in his throat as the girl's voice filled the room. Soft yet commanding, "You cannot hide from the truth." Panic gripped him as the walls of his room seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting like liquid. He bolted from the bed, his lantern clutched tightly, and fled into the hallway. The mansion was unnaturally quiet, the air thick and cold. As he hurried toward his father's quarters, he heard footsteps behind him, soft, deliberate, and unyielding. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. But the footsteps persisted. Bursting into his father's room, Victor found Mr. Kian sitting rigidly in his chair, staring at the fireplace. The flames flickered strangely, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Father Victor began, his voice trembling. "Something is in this house. Something unnatural." Mr. Kian turned slowly, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, Victor saw fear in his father's eyes. "We cannot let fear control you," Mr. Kian said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Whatever this is, it cannot harm us. It's nothing." But his words rang hollow. That night, the girl appeared again. This time to Mr. Kian. She stood at the edge of his bed, her pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the dying fire. Her eyes bore into his, filled with sorrow and accusation. "You cannot escape what you've done," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before Mr. Kian could respond, she dissolved into mist, leaving the room frigid and silent. From that point forward, the mansion's hauntings became relentless. Chandeliers swayed violently without cause, their crystal ornaments shattering onto the marble floors. Paintings fell from the walls, their frames splintered as if struck by unseen hands. Rooms once warm and inviting turned bitterly cold, frost creeping along the windows despite the blazing summer outside. Servants who remained whispered of seeing the girl in their peripheral vision, a fleeting figure at the end of a hallway, or a shadow that moved against the flow of light. One maid, while dusting the grand dining room, claimed to have felt icy fingers brush against her neck. She fled screaming, abandoning her duties altogether. Victor's mental state deteriorated. He became gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He spent hours in the library, poring over the old journal and other records of the estate's history. He was desperate to uncover the truth that the girl demanded he face, yet terrified of what he might find. Meanwhile, Mr. Keen's composure cracked. The man who had once commanded fear and respect now appeared frail and uncertain. He ordered priests to bless the mansion, but their prayers seemed to have no effect. One priest fled mid-ritual, claiming he could feel the hands of the dead pressing on his shoulders. The girl's presence became more forceful. She no longer appeared merely as an apparition but began interacting with the physical world. Doors slammed violently, furniture was overturned, and mirrors shattered without warning. One evening, as Victor walked through the dining hall, he saw the heavy oak table levitate briefly before crashing down with a deafening roar. "What do you want from me?" he screamed into the empty room, his voice echoing. The only reply was her voice. Faint and chilling, the truth cannot stay buried. The climax of the terror came on a stormy night. Thunder rolled endlessly, and lightning illuminated the mansion in brief, blinding flashes. Victor and his father were in the grand hall when the girl appeared, more solid than ever before. Her dress billowed as though caught in an unseen wind, and her eyes glowed faintly. "You have taken much," she said, her voice layered with sorrow and rage. "Now, you must give." Before either man could respond, the walls of the mansion seemed to groan, and the floor beneath them trembled. Objects flew across the room, smashing against the walls. The girl raised her hand, and an invisible force sent both Victor and his father to their knees. "The time has come," she said, and then as quickly as it began, the chaos stopped. The girl vanished, leaving the mansion silent once more. Victor and Mr. Keen sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. They both knew that whatever lay ahead would be far worse than the torment they had endured so far. The truth she sought to reveal would change everything, and there would be no turning back. For weeks, Victor and his father avoided discussing the haunting directly, but the tension between them was palpable. The mansion remained in a perpetual state of dread, each creak of the floorboards and flicker of light feeding their growing paranoia. Victor continued his obsessive search for answers, poring over the journal and any other records he could find. The more he read, the more he realized that the Keen family's legacy was not one of triumph, but of blood and betrayal. Servants who dared to stay began to report new horrors. One claimed to have seen spectral faces in the windows, their hollow eyes watching from the void. Another swore she heard her name whispered as she walked through the east wing, though no one was there. Mr. Keen, once dismissive of such tales, now paced his study at night, muttering to himself and glancing nervously at every shadow. The mansion itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Walls groaned as if under some immense pressure, and the floors creaked as though bearing unseen footsteps. Fires in the hearth would suddenly extinguish, leaving rooms icy cold. The once pristine mirrors now warped, reflecting distorted images that lingered just a moment too long. Victor's dreams grew darker. Each night he found himself in the forest, surrounded by mist and the faint sound of the girl's sorrowful melody. Shadows loomed closer, their forms monstrous and ever-changing. The girl would appear briefly, her gaze heavy with sorrow and accusation, before vanishing into the void. He woke each time drenched in sweat, her final words echoing in his mind, "You cannot escape." The girl's presence reached a horrifying crescendo one evening as Victor sat in the library. The temperature dropped sharply, and the faint scent of lilies filled the air, a smell he now associated with her. Books flew from the shelves, their pages fluttering like the wings of trapped birds. The room seemed to close in around him, and then she appeared, standing between the towering shelves. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "You must face what has been hidden, or all will be lost." Victor's voice trembled as he replied, "What do you want from me?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I want what was taken." "Restore what is owed and I will leave what was taken," Victor asked, desperation lacing his words. But before she could answer, the candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. The haunting showed no sign of abating, and Victor realized that the only way to end the torment was to uncover the truth she sought to reveal. He resolved to delve deeper into the mansion's history, no matter the cost. Yet with every step he took, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the whispers louder, and the line between the living and the dead blurred further. The mansion, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, and the only escape lay in facing the truth he had spent his life avoiding. Part 6. Seeking Answers. The torment of the Kian mansion had reached an unbearable pitch. The walls seemed to close in on Victor and his father, their oppressive weight pressing down on every moment. Servants abandoned their posts in droves, leaving the once bustling estate eerily silent. Even the air in the mansion seemed alive, heavy with whispers and accusations that neither man could escape. The silence was not a reprieve but a suffocating presence, filled with unseen eyes and unheard voices. Desperation drove Mr. Kian to seek help from beyond the realm of reason. Despite his usual disdain for village traditions, he summoned a shaman rumored to possess the power to commune with spirits. The shaman, an elderly woman with deep-set eyes and a voice like rustling leaves, arrived cloaked in the earthy scent of herbs and incense. Her weathered hands clutched a carved wooden staff, and her expression bore the weight of countless tales of the supernatural. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the shaman was escorted through the grand iron gates of the Kian estate. Whispers spread like wildfire. If even the mighty Mr. Kian sought such help, the mansion's horrors must truly be extraordinary. In the dim light of the great hall, the shaman stood motionless, her gaze sweeping over the opulent but lifeless space. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the faint scent of lilies, a harbinger of the girl's presence, lingered. Her expression darkened as she scanned the room, her staff striking the floor with a sharp crack that echoed unnervingly. "This house is heavy with sorrow," the shaman said, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. "The spirits here are restless, their cries for justice unanswered." Victor shifted uncomfortably, his skepticism clashing with his growing fear. Mr. Kian, usually so commanding, appeared diminished in her presence. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The shaman began to chant softly, her words in ancient language that neither Victor nor his father understood. She scattered a handful of ash onto the marble floor, her staff striking the ground rhythmically. The ashes swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. The flames of the room's candles flickered wildly, their light casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly the shaman's chant ceased. She raised her hand, her eyes wide and unblinking. "They have been wronged," she said, her voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. "Your family's sins have awakened them. They demand restitution." Victor felt his heart sink. "What sins? What have we done?" The shaman turned her piercing gaze to him. "You carry the burden of your ancestors. The blood they spilled cries out from the earth beneath your feet. You cannot escape the consequences of their greed and cruelty." Mr. Kian's face darkened. "This is nonsense," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "What happened in the past is long buried. It has no bearing on us now." The shaman's expression hardened. "The past is never buried, Mr. Kian. It lingers, festering in the shadows, waiting for a reckoning. You may not have held the blade, but your hands are stained all the same." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. The girl's cryptic warnings, the strange occurrences, the overwhelming sense of guilt that had suffused the mansion, all of it began to coalesce into a grim picture. "What do they want from us?" Victor asked, his voice trembling. The shaman knelt on the cold marble floor, her fingers tracing the swirling ash patterns. "They want the truth to be uncovered. They want their suffering acknowledged. Only then will they find peace." Victor exchanged a nervous glance with his father. Mr. Kian's jaw was set, his eyes narrowing in defiance. "If they want the truth, they can have it," he said coldly. "But I will not be judged by the dead." The shaman's eyes flashed with anger. "You do not have a choice, Mr. Kian. They are already here." As if in response, a sudden gust of wind tore through the hall, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Victor heard a faint melody, sorrowful and haunting, rising from the shadows. The girl's voice echoed faintly, "You cannot hide." The shaman struck her staff against the floor, and the candles reignited, their flames casting an eerie glow. "The spirits are patient no longer," she said. "If you refuse to face them, They will take what is owed by force. What must we do? Victor asked, his voice barely audible. You must seek the truth, the shaman replied. The answers lie within the history of this house, in the deeds of those who came before you. But beware, the truth is not without its cost. Victor felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. His father remained silent, his expression unreadable. The shaman rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. I can guide you no further, she said. The path ahead is yours to walk. But remember this, the spirits do not seek vengeance for its own sake. They seek balance. Give them what they are owed, and they will leave you in peace. She turned to leave, her staff tapping against the floor with each step. As she reached the threshold, she paused, looking back at Victor. Do not delay, she warned. The longer the truth remains hidden, the stronger their grip on this place will become. The shaman's departure left a profound silence in her wake. Victor and his father stood in the great hall, the flickering candlelight casting distorted shadows on their faces. The weight of her words hung heavily between them, unspoken but undeniable. Victor stared at the swirls of ash left on the floor, his thoughts spiraling. What truth could be so powerful as to unleash this chaos? And could it ever truly be resolved? Mr. Keane's voice broke the silence. This is nothing but superstition, he muttered, though his tone betrayed his unease. We will deal with this in our own way. Victor glanced at his father, his skepticism growing. For the first time he wondered whether Mr. Keane knew more than he let on. In the days that followed, the mansion seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting. Victor began scouring the library for records of the estate's history, piecing together fragments of a story long buried. He uncovered deeds and contracts, their ink faded but their meaning clear. The Keane family's wealth had been built on betrayal, theft, and bloodshed. Lands had been seized, lives destroyed, all in the name of power. The more Victor read, the heavier the air in the mansion became. Whispers grew louder, shadows darker. The girl appeared more frequently, her sorrowful eyes now tinged with fury. Her voice, once soft, now carried a sharp edge. You cannot escape what you owe. Victor realized there was no escaping the reckoning that awaited. The sins of the past had returned, demanding justice, and the Keane family had no choice but to face the consequences. The hauntings intensified with every passing day. One night, Victor awoke to the sound of faint sobbing echoing through the halls. He followed the sound, lantern in hand, only to find the girl standing at the base of the grand staircase. Her eyes glistened with tears, her form translucent and wavering like a flame. She pointed toward the east wing, her voice trembling but insistent. The truth lies there. Victor hesitated, his pulse racing. The east wing had been sealed off for decades, its rooms untouched and shrouded in dust. Gathering his courage, he stepped toward the forbidden wing, the girl's presence guiding him. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers of the mansion swelled into a mournful chorus. He reached a locked door at the end of the corridor. The girl appeared beside him, her hand hovering over the lock. With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. Furniture lay covered in white sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. On a desk in the corner, Victor spotted a leather-bound journal. The girl gestured toward it, her expression grave. With trembling hands, Victor opened the journal. Its pages detailed the atrocities committed by his ancestors, their ruthless acquisition of land, their betrayal of allies, and the countless lives lost to their greed. The final entry read, "Their cries haunt me even now. I fear our legacy will bring ruin to those who follow." Tears blurred Victor's vision as he closed the journal. He turned to the girl, her sorrow mirrored in his own. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. She placed a cold hand on his shoulder, her touch both comforting and chilling. "Acknowledge their pain. Make amends. Only then can the cycle be broken." Victor nodded, determination hardening his features. The weight of his family's sins was unbearable, but he knew he had to face it. Together with the girl, he would uncover the full truth and perhaps finally bring peace to the haunted mansion. Part 7. The Failed Ritual. Desperation consumed Mr. Keane. The shaman's warnings weighed heavily on his mind, though he refused to admit it aloud. In his arrogance, he decided to take matters into his own hands. If the spirits sought justice, he would silence them with force. With the help of an ambitious priest, known more for his showmanship than his faith, Mr. Kean arranged a grand ritual to banish the spirits tormenting his family. Preparations began at dusk. The great hall was stripped of its opulence and transformed into a ceremonial space. Heavy incense filled the air, its cloying scent barely masking the unease that clung to every corner. At the center of the room, a large circle was drawn in white chalk, etched with ancient symbols copied from obscure texts. Candles lined the perimeter, their flames flickering, as if reluctant to stay lit. The once grand chandelier now hung like a skeletal reminder of the mansion's former glory, its crystals dulled by dust. Victor watched from the shadows, his skepticism mingled with dread. He had begged his father to reconsider, to find another way. "This ritual won't work," he had said. "The shaman warned us this isn't about banishment. It's about facing the truth." Mr. Kean dismissed him with a sharp wave of his hand. "Truth won't save us. Action will. These spirits will learn that they cannot control me." The priest arrived, draped in ceremonial robes that seemed more theatrical than sacred. He carried a heavy tome bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. His demeanor exuded confidence, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. He had heard the whispers of the mansion's hauntings, but the promise of Mr. Kean's wealth outweighed his fear. Yet, beneath his bravado, the priest's hands trembled as he placed the tome on a makeshift altar. The ritual began as the clock struck midnight. The priest chanted in a booming voice, reciting incantations in a language neither Victor nor Mr. Kean understood. The candle's flames flared unnaturally high, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air grew heavy, pressing down on their chests like an invisible weight. The symbols within the chalk circle glowed faintly, their edges pulsating as if alive. For a moment it seemed as though the ritual might work. The oppressive atmosphere lightened, and the whispers that had plagued the mansion fell silent. Victor dared to hope, but that hope was short-lived. A sudden gust of wind tore through the great hall, extinguishing half the candles. The remaining flames sputtered and danced wildly. The priest stumbled over his words, his booming voice faltering. The symbols on the floor began to smudge, as if an unseen hand was erasing them. The silence shattered as a piercing wail echoed through the mansion, a sound so raw and anguished it made Victor's blood run cold. The girl appeared at the edge of the circle, her translucent form shimmering with an eerie light. Her sorrowful gaze was now filled with fury. "You dare defy us," she said, her voice reverberating with a supernatural resonance. The priest dropped his tone, his confidence crumbling. This isn't supposed to happen," he stammered, backing away. I need more time." "There is no more time," the girl said, her voice sharp as a blade. She raised her hand, and the remaining candles extinguished in unison. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by the ghostly glow emanating from her figure. The air grew colder, and the walls of the great hall began to groan. Objects flew across the room, crashing into walls with violent force. The heavy dining table lifted off the ground, hovering menacingly before slamming down with a deafening thud. Victor grabbed his father's arm, shouting over the chaos, "We have to stop this. The ritual is only making it worse." Mr. Kean shook his head, his face pale but defiant. "No. This is my house, my legacy. I will not be driven out by shadows." The girl stepped closer, her form becoming more solid with each step. Around her, other spirits began to materialize, men, women, and children, their faces etched with anguish. Their collective presence filled the room, their sorrow and rage palpable. The temperature in the room plummeted further, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. "You built your wealth on our suffering," the girl said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You took what was ours and left us with nothing, and now you think to erase us." Mr. Kean fell to his knees, his bravado finally shattered. I didn't do this," he stammered. "It wasn't me, it was my ancestors." "You benefited from their crimes," the girl said. "You upheld their legacy. And now you must answer for it." The priest tried to flee, but the spirits blocked his path. He screamed as they surrounded him, their translucent hands reaching out, their touch draining the color from his face. He collapsed, unconscious, and the spirits turned their attention back to the Keans. Victor stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, there must be another way. Tell us what we can do to make this right." The girl hesitated, her gaze softening slightly. "Acknowledge the truth," she said. "Restore what was taken. Only then can balance be restored." Victor nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll do it. I promise." But before the girl could respond, Mr. Kean scrambled to his feet. "No," he shouted. "This is my house, my family's legacy. I won't let you take it from me." He lunged at the girl, his hand outstretched as if to strike her. But his hand passed through her form, and an unseen force hurled him backward. He crashed into the wall, gasping for breath. The girl turned to Victor, her expression grave. "Your father's defiance will be his undoing," she said. "But you still have a chance. Do not waste it." The spirits began to recede, their forms fading into the shadows. The girl lingered for a moment longer, her gaze locked on Victor. "The truth lies within these walls," she said. "Find it, or suffer the same fate as those before you." With that, she vanished, and the great hall fell silent once more. The damage was immense: furniture overturned, walls cracked, and the once grand chandelier shattered on the floor. The priest was carried out by the remaining servants, his body limp and lifeless. Mr. Kean sat slumped against the wall, his face ashen. Victor knelt in the center of the room, his heart heavy with the weight of the girl's words. The ritual had failed, and the spirit's wrath had only grown stronger. But amidst the chaos, a path forward had been revealed. The truth awaited, buried deep within the mansion's history, and Victor knew that uncovering it was the only way to save his family. As dawn broke over the shattered remnants of the great hall, Victor made a silent vow he would face the truth, no matter the cost. The spirits demanded justice, and he would not rest until they found peace. But deep down he wondered, would the truth bring redemption? Or would it destroy him along with everything he had ever known? The mansion, once a fortress of power, now felt like a crumbling prison. Shadows seemed to linger too long in corners, and every creak of the floorboards carried an ominous weight. Victor knew the spirits were not done with them yet. Their anger had only begun to manifest, and with each passing hour, their grip on the mansion tightened. He stood amidst the ruins of the great hall, the shattered chandelier sparkling dimly in the morning light. Victor's resolve hardened as he thought of the girl's final words. If the truth lay within these walls, then he would find it no matter what horrors awaited him. Part 8. A Vengeful Justice. The atmosphere within the Kean mansion was suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and the lingering tension grew unbearable. Victor scoured the mansion for clues to the truth the girl had spoken of, yet every discovery only deepened his dread. Journals filled with cryptic passages, deeds signed in blood, and faded photographs hinted at a past steeped in cruelty and betrayal. Mr. Kean, however, remained defiant, refusing to acknowledge the ghosts of his ancestors' sins. One fateful night, the air grew unnaturally still. A storm brewed on the horizon, lightning illuminating the mansion's silhouette like a warning. Victor paced in the library, his mind racing. The girl's words haunted him: "Find the truth, or suffer the same fate as those before you." His father, meanwhile, drank alone in the study, his stubbornness eroding into desperation. As the clock struck midnight, the storm broke with a deafening crash of thunder. The walls of the mansion seemed to tremble, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the halls. Victor froze, his lantern flickering. A chill swept through the room, and he knew they had returned. The girl's apparition appeared in the great hall, her form more solid than ever before. She stood at the center, her pale figure glowing with an ethereal light. Around her, the spirits of the oppressed began to materialize: men, women, and children, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Their presence was overwhelming, the air thick with their anguish. Victor descended the staircase cautiously, his heart pounding. Mr. Kean stormed into the hall, his face a mask of fury. "Enough of this," he shouted, his voice echoing through the vast space. "I will not be intimidated by phantoms." The girl turned to him, her gaze piercing. "Your arrogance has blinded you," she said, her voice resonant and haunting. You cling to a legacy built on suffering, yet you refuse to see the truth. What truth? Mr. Kian demanded. That my ancestors did what was necessary to survive? That they claimed what was theirs by right? The spirits stirred, their voices rising in a ghostly chorus. It was not yours to take, the girl said. You stole our land, our lives, our futures. And now, you will face the consequences. The ground beneath them trembled. Cracks spread across the marble floor, radiating outward like a spider web. The spirits advanced, their translucent forms growing darker, more menacing. Victor stepped between them and his father, his hands raised. Wait, he cried. Please. There must be another way. The girl's gaze softened as she looked at Victor. You seek redemption, she said. But your father seeks only to preserve his power. He cannot be saved. Mr. Kian laughed bitterly. Spare me your judgments, he spat. You are nothing but shadows of the past. You have no power here. At his words, the spirits let out a collective wail that shook the walls. The chandelier above them swayed violently before crashing to the floor in a shower of glass. Victor shielded his face as the room descended into chaos. You will pay for your arrogance, the girl said, her voice reverberating like a thunderclap. She raised her hand, and the floor beneath Mr. Kian began to crack and buckle. He staggered, his defiance replaced by fear. What are you doing?" he shouted. The ground split open with a deafening roar. A chasm yawned at Mr. Kian's feet, its depths illuminated by an unnatural fiery glow. He tried to back away, but the spirits closed in, their hollow eyes locking onto him. "You cannot escape," the girl said. "The weight of your sins will drag you down." Victor lunged forward, trying to pull his father away from the edge. "Father, please. Let it go. Admit what was done and make amends." But Mr. Kian shook him off, his face twisted with rage. "I will not bow to them," he shouted. "This is my house, my legacy." The spirits surged forward, their forms intertwining with the shadows. They reached for Mr. Kian, their translucent hands passing through him, yet leaving him visibly weakened. He fell to his knees, his defiance crumbling under their collective weight. The girl stepped closer, her expression both sorrowful and resolute. "You have brought this upon yourself," she said. "Your refusal to face the truth has sealed your fate." The chasm widened, and with a final, agonized cry, Mr. Kian was swallowed by the earth. The ground closed over him, leaving no trace of his existence. The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Only the girl remained, her gaze fixed on Victor. Tears streamed down Victor's face as he knelt on the fractured floor. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." The girl knelt beside him, her cold hand resting on his shoulder. "You have the chance to break the cycle," she said. "Acknowledge the pain caused by your family. Restore what was taken. Only then can balance be restored." Victor nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will," he said. "I swear it." The girl offered him a faint smile before her form began to fade. "Do not forget," she said, her voice lingering even as she disappeared. "The past must be honored, or it will return." The mansion was silent once more. But it was a different kind of silence, one that carried the weight of possibility. Victor stood alone in the great hall, the shattered remnants of his family's legacy around him. The spirits were gone, but their message remained clear. In the days that followed, the full weight of the truth began to sink in. Victor ventured into the long-forgotten rooms of the mansion, uncovering more evidence of his family's wrongdoings. He found letters written by desperate farmers, begging for leniency, and records of land stolen under false pretenses. Every discovery was a dagger to his heart, but he knew he could not turn away. Victor took his findings to the villagers, meeting with the descendants of those wronged by his family. At first they greeted him with suspicion and anger, unwilling to believe that a Kian could truly seek atonement. But his sincerity broke through their defenses. He returned lands that had been seized, offered reparations, and used his wealth to rebuild what his ancestors had destroyed. The mansion itself underwent a transformation. Victor turned it into a sanctuary for the poor and the displaced, its once oppressive walls now a haven for those in need. The grand halls echoed with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the fear and despair that had once filled them. Though the girl's apparition never returned, Victor often felt her presence. On quiet nights when the wind whispered through the halls, he would catch glimpses of her reflection in the windows or hear the faint melody of her sorrowful song. He carried her words with him, a reminder of the power of truth and the cost of denying it. The Kian mansion, once a symbol of greed and cruelty, became a beacon of hope. And as Victor worked to rebuild what his family had destroyed, he found a measure of peace, knowing that justice had finally been served. The transformation was not without its challenges. There were moments when Victor doubted himself, questioned whether his actions could ever atone for the sins of the past. Yet each step forward was met with gratitude and hope from those who had suffered. Slowly but surely, the scars of history began to heal. And so the mansion stood not as a monument to greed, but as a testament to the power of redemption, a living legacy of justice and reconciliation. Part 9. Legacy of the Cursed Mansion. The fall of the Kian mansion rippled through the village like a thunderclap. The once mighty structure now stood in eerie silence, its cracked walls and shattered windows reflecting the horrors that had unfolded within. The ground where Mr. Kian had been swallowed remained scarred, a gaping wound that the earth refused to heal. The villagers, long cowed by the tyranny of the Kian family, began to step out from the shadows of fear, their voices rising in cautious unity. For the first time in generations, the villagers dared to gather near the mansion's ruins. They whispered stories of the spirits that had emerged to exact justice, of the ghostly girl who had spoken for the voiceless. The mansion, once an oppressive symbol of wealth and cruelty, had become a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked greed. Its towering silhouette was no longer intimidating but haunting, a skeletal frame that seemed to watch over the village with silent reproach. Victor Kian had vanished from the public eye after the spirit's reckoning. Many speculated that he had fled in shame, while others believed he remained hidden within the mansion, consumed by guilt. In truth, Victor had retreated into the remnants of the estate, not to hide but to honor his promise. He spent weeks combing through forgotten rooms, unearthing every artifact of his family's dark past. Deeds of stolen land, letters of betrayal, and ledgers of blood-soaked wealth painted a damning picture of the Kian dynasty. Victor knew that redemption could never erase the pain his family had caused, but he believed in the power of restitution. He gathered the evidence and approached the villagers with humility, offering to return what had been unjustly taken. Fields that had been seized generations ago were restored to their rightful owners, and reparations were made to families who had lost everything under the Kian regime. Victor's actions were met with skepticism at first, but his earnestness and unwavering determination began to break down the walls of mistrust. The ruins of the mansion became a communal space for reckoning and healing. Villagers who had once feared its halls now approached with offerings and prayers, honoring the spirits who had brought justice. The site was transformed into a shrine, its haunting presence a reminder of the cost of tyranny and the resilience of those who had suffered under it. Children who had been told to avoid the mansion now played in its shadow, their laughter filling the air as a symbol of renewal. Over time, the mansion itself seemed to succumb to the will of the village. Its walls crumbled further, vines and moss overtaking the stone. Nature reclaimed the land, and what was once a fortress of cruelty became a garden of quiet reflection. Flowers grew where the great hall had stood, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness that had once consumed the place. The chasm where Mr. Kian had fallen remained untouched, a solemn reminder of the price he had paid for his defiance. Victor continued to work alongside the villagers, dedicating his life to rebuilding what his family had destroyed. He turned the Kian name into one of service rather than domination, funding schools, building homes, and ensuring that no one in the village went hungry. Though his efforts could never undo the past, they planted the seeds of a future rooted in compassion and justice. Despite his efforts, Victor often found himself drawn back to the ruins at night. He would sit beneath the fractured archway of the main hall, gazing at the stars and listening to the whispers of the wind. Though the girl's apparition never returned, he felt her presence in the stillness, her message echoing in his heart: the past must be honored, or it will return. The villagers, too, kept the memory of the mansion alive in their own way. Festivals were held each year to honor the spirits who had fought for justice, and stories of the cursed mansion were passed down through generations. Elders recounted the tale of the girl who had stood against a legacy of greed, her voice a beacon for the voiceless. The younger generations, free from the fear that had gripped their parents, embraced the lessons of the past as a guide for the future. But the ruins were not only a reminder of tragedy. They became a place where lessons were taught, where the village's children would gather to hear tales of resilience and justice. The elders spoke of how the mansion had once loomed over them like a dark cloud and how they had endured its shadow. It became a tradition to leave offerings of flowers and small trinkets at the edge of the ruins, honoring the spirits and the girl who had spoken on their behalf. Victor's dedication to making amends transformed not only the village but himself. Though the scars of the past could never truly fade, his work brought new hope to a community long deprived of it. Roads were built where there had been none, fields that had once been bare and now bloomed with crops, their abundance feeding not just the body but the spirit of the village. Years turned into decades, and the mansion became one with the land. Trees grew tall around its perimeter, their roots weaving through the cracks of its foundation. Moss blanketed the stones, softening their jagged edges. The chasm remained, though its edges were overgrown with wildflowers, a quiet testament to the moment when justice had claimed its due. Victor aged alongside the village, his hair turning gray and his steps slowing. Yet, his resolve never faltered. He dedicated the final years of his life to documenting the story of the mansion, ensuring that future generations would remember not just the tragedy but the transformation that had followed. In his writings, he included every detail: the sins of his family, the suffering of the villagers, the girl's haunting gaze, and the reckoning that had changed everything. When Victor passed away, the villagers mourned him as one of their own. They held a ceremony at the mansion's ruins, placing his ashes beneath the wildflowers that had grown in the chasm. Though his name had once been a symbol of fear, it was now remembered with reverence and gratitude. The younger generation carried his legacy forward, continuing the work he had begun. The village thrived, its people united by a shared history and a collective commitment to justice. They built a small monument at the edge of the ruins, inscribed with the words Victor had written in his final days: "The past must be honored, not hidden. From truth we build a future." As the decades passed, the mansion faded further into obscurity, its skeletal frame swallowed by the land. Yet its story endured. It was whispered by the wind, carried in the songs of the villagers, and etched into the hearts of those who lived in its shadow. The legacy of the Kian mansion was no longer one of greed and cruelty but of redemption and renewal. And though the mansion itself was gone, the lessons it had taught remained a haunting legacy that would never be forgotten. In the hearts of the villagers and the pages of history, its story would live on, a cautionary tale of justice, resilience, and the power of redemption. The ruins, now a sanctuary of nature, stood as a silent testament to the endurance of truth. Overgrown with ivy and flowers, the remnants became a symbol of how even the darkest legacies could transform into sources of healing. Birds nested where rafters once loomed, and the rustle of leaves replaced the cries of despair that had once haunted its halls. The Kian mansion's story, once feared, became a tale of redemption shared across generations, ensuring the village would never forget the price of its peace.